Welcome to The Hype is Real. This is a podcast for revenue leaders by revenue leaders, brought to you by Outplay and Rev Genius. Well, normally you would have your two hosts, Laxman and Jared, who you're quite familiar with. Laxman is from Outplay, Jared, of course, is from Rev Genius. But today, surprisingly, both of them are not here today. They're, of course, gone out there to spread some holiday cheer for the rest of the world and rest of the sales folks and revenue leaders out there as well. So I'll be stepping in, and I'm lucky. My name is Sandeep John, and I take care of demand gen at Outplay. Well, for all of you who've been following this podcast, you know that we just finished season 1, and this is season 2 that's going on as well. This is a very special season because this season we're speaking to the most powerful women revenue leaders out there who are really taking the SaaS industry by storm, and hopefully to inspire several of all of you leaders out there who are looking to take this journey, take this path as well. And how do you get there? What can you do? What are the big challenges you need to look at as well? And I'm very lucky to fortunate enough to interview our guest today, who has almost a decade of experience building and managing customer success and revenue generating teams, and has almost mastered the approach of embracing a human first leadership. She's also built experience in building account management structures from scratch and literally scaling B2B client experiences. She currently works as the COO of Refine Labs, which is a demand accelerator for B2B SaaS companies, and is also the co-host of Talent Destination podcast. Do go check out that podcast as well. We and I am very fortunate to be interviewing Megan Bowen for this episode. Welcome, Megan. Welcome to this podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Awesome. Let's begin with a fun question. If you had to write a book now, what would that book be about? What would you call that book, and why would you pick that book?
So I actually am going to steal the name of my podcast, Talent Destination. And I do have some aspirations to document my journey and write a book. I would call it Talent Destination, and the premise and sort of the point of the book would really be to share from my own experience about creating the conditions for people to do the best work of their lives. And so I've been at many different companies, from early stage, late stage, B2B SaaS, agency. And when it comes down to it, I think there is a set of ingredients that are really required to create at your company so that you attract top talent. They're set up for success to achieve goals and do great work and grow professionally. And for ultimately you to create the conditions to achieve impressive business outcomes. And so I have a strong point of view on what those conditions are. I have experience in practice building organizations and infusing those ingredients. So I know firsthand what has worked, what doesn't work, what the challenges are. So I would write a book about that, and in hopes that new startup founders and CEOs would get inspiration in how to think about building their own companies from the beginning.
That's awesome. And we do hope that you write that book someday. Coincidentally, in fact, we interviewed Latani from Sixth Sense as well. And she recently put out a book, I think a second edition of her book as well. But yeah, we really hope that you can put out your book soon. That'll be really awesome.
Definitely. Latani is great. She's a wonderful marketing leader.
Awesome. Now, in the same context of what you were mentioning well as well, do you think there's been a shift in the way people work? And what do you think really, how can organizations really succeed in taking this very people first approach? Given that, today's a very interesting world, right? We're not just in office, there's a sense of remote, there's a sense of hybrid, and all of these permutations and combinations as well. So it is not as what it used to be before. Given everything in the world, the new world that we live in, how has there been a shift, and what should companies do to really become people first?
Yeah, and I think obviously the pandemic accelerated normalizing remote work, and that has really changed a lot. One of my people that I look up to, Christopher Lochhead, talks a lot about this concept of a new category of human, native digital versus native analog. So the way to break down these terms, a native analog essentially experiences life in the physical world first, and they use technology to enhance their physical life, where a native digital actually primarily has their life digitally and is enhanced by sort of the physical world. Most people under the age of 35 would be classified as a native digital. And so what that means and what you're seeing is that as time goes on, the population of native digitals is overcoming and becoming the majority. And the reality is this new generation of human experiences the world in a very different way. The pandemic creating remote work has further accelerated this. And so really, I think that what has happened is it's not about building sort of a traditional business and expecting that people adopt those traditional roles of the way that things have been done. Everything about our society, how we work, how we live, is going to be challenged by this native digital generation. And really what they care about with respect to work is very different from how things have been done. So the landscape that we're already seeing now is people are refusing to go back to the office. They know they don't need to be there to add value. And we're going to see, I think, more and more changes. So this term talent destination that I coined, instead of thinking about really building a company, think about creating a place where really talented people want to spend their time. And I don't believe that people work at companies forever, right? So people that are attracted to go to a place, they feel that the conditions for them to be successful, do some really important work, grow professionally, and then move on to their next chapter. So I think companies that are smart are thinking about this, and they're thinking about, how do I differentiate my company? How do I create a talent destination, not just a business? And how do I attract that talent and create the conditions to meet them where they're at in order to achieve business outcomes? So it's really flipping the paradigm of not just doing things the way that they've always been done, and delivering, sort of meeting this new generation where they're at. And so I think we're going to see a lot more shifts and changes, but I think that's the predominant shift that's happening beyond just the pandemic accelerating remote work.
I think that's brilliant. I mean, at least for me, the connotation of talent destination is the fact that companies should essentially be that. You create an environment where people just want to work with you. And I think rightly you said the fact that work is not forever. You move from one company to another company, but at least you want to make sure that you do great work in your company. So companies enabling people to work and do their best work in that company is probably the biggest success. Wow, awesome. I think even the fact that I think we always knew the fact that, given my gray hair, I'm probably, what is that, native analog or
native analog.
Native
I am
analog.
too, technically.
I didn't know a term like that even exists, but I think we always knew the fact that these things were there. But I love the fact that now there is a term for that, native digital, and the fact that, like you said, majority of the workforce is native digital, and experiences are going to be, their expectations are very different from someone who's like native analog, for example, and you've got to look at them differently, or set things there. Very interesting, very interesting points there. All right. As a CEO right now at Refined Labs, how do you sort of bridge the gap between other departments, other leaders in the organization? And what can you do, sort of align teams, keep them in sync, and sort of push the chaos? Because you're trying to propagate something that's, say, pretty people-centric, and all companies are trying to do that. But sometimes, and I've seen this as well, right? When you're a smaller company, it's probably easier to manage that. You can keep the DNA of what you're trying to do in the same way. But as companies grow and become larger organizations, a lot of people come from outside, and that DNA sort of changes over time. So what do you do to sort of align everyone to make sure that, hey, okay, this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it, so that we're all aligned, all working to the bigger cause?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say there's sort of three factors here that I really consider. And so I think your company's core values are really critical. To your point, as you grow, it becomes harder to control. So you really have to use the values that you communicate as the guardrails for behavior and what good looks like at the company. So we actually rebooted our values after 2 years, once we sort of hit 100 employees, because we realized that they needed a refresh and they needed to sort of represent the new phase that we were at. So in addition to having them, you need to talk about them. They need to be visible. You need to recognize people for them. That really has a strong influence on how people behave in an organization. I think the second piece is really like your operating rhythms. And so you need to have, I have sort of what I call my like operating system, and you need to have things in place. What are the meeting cadences? How are we planning? How are we executing? How are we making decisions? How are we communicating those decisions? And so you have a variety of tools to do that, whether it's Slack or your intranet or email or company meetings, smaller department meetings, but having an intentional rhythm of how decisions are made and how things are communicated throughout the organization is really important. And that's something that has to evolve and change over time. And then I think the last thing is I talk a lot about like internal communications. And a lot of times when I say that, people think, internal communications, like, emails or information that you're sending to the company. But in my view, it's much bigger than that. And so to get internal communications right, of course, you need to like disseminate information to people, but you need to create a culture where beyond just the leaders, people are communicating and collaborating effectively with each other. And people understand the role that they have, the roles that others have, how things that they'll do will impact others, and create a culture of ownership in ensuring that there are no silos and that people are being considerate and, looping in the right people, collaborating and communicating effectively. Everyone at the company needs to participate in that, especially in a remote and distributed workforce. And so that's probably one of the more challenging elements of it that I'm constantly working at. But I think those are sort of the top three things that you can kind of control with sort of values, communicating values top down, creating some structure with operating rhythms, and then really creating a culture of ownership at every level to participate in effective communication and collaboration.
I'm going to slightly pivot there, Megan. I think one interesting point is the fact that how do you keep that culture going? Is it in the form of training or in the way you do things? For example, let's say you have newer folk joining and newer leaders joining into an organization. Is it a company's concentrated effort in saying, okay, all of you have to go through a culture training, for example? That's probably one way of doing it. Or it could be, it's the way we do things as well. Is the fact that we're open about our work, we're transparent about how we run projects. How would you sort of put that whole thing together?
So we actually have developed what we call a culture playbook, where we have a lot of this documented. It's publicly available on my LinkedIn profile too. But basically, it's sort of a manual of how the company operates, right? And what our culture is all about. So that's sort of the artifact or the document. And then I think depending upon the type of person that enters the organization as part of onboarding, again, it will depend on the role, but yes, we talk a lot about sort of how we operate so that people are able to integrate effectively into the company.
Now, I think one thing that I think nowadays, at least, is getting spoken a lot, of course, is companies and employers trying to figure out what one should do to make sure that employees take care of themselves, or at least what employees should do to take care of their own well-beings, given the fact that, again, it is, I still remember the early days of the pandemic. It was very stressful. You weren't sure about what's going on. You're fully remote and all of that kind of stuff. And there's family around you. So there's just too many things, too many variables at that stage. It's probably better now. But then I think you also have, like you said, beautifully said, the digital native employees joining in a workforce fully remote. It's a whole new sort of arena or things that people are dealing with. So how can one ensure that they prioritize their well-being ahead of everything else? And are there things people should be doing today?
Yeah, and so I think that my biggest thing here is really leading by example. I think everyone's, mental and emotional well-being is ultimately their own responsibility. But I think that to create a talent destination, for example, you need to understand that you are dealing with humans, and you need to create the space for psychological safety, so that people feel empowered to do things that they need to do to take care of their own mental, physical, and emotional well-being. And then, there are things that I think that you can do, sort of as a company to promote that. So like, for example, we have no meetings Fridays because we know that there can be sort of Zoom fatigue and meeting overload. So there are things that you can do in your company to promote that. We also have a lot of, sort of mental health resources that we make available to our team. And we have a very open door policy with our people team and our leaders. So our team feels comfortable to let us know if something's going on and they do need some help or some assistance so that we can provide that to them. So I think there's a fine line of like, I don't think it's the company's responsibility to like make sure that everyone's okay. Like people need to have some agency on that, but they need to do things to not add and create more stress than is sort of normal and just running a business. And they need, I think, to create the space for people to feel like they can take a mental health day. Have a day of deep focused work with no meetings, know that there are resources available and that if they do get to a bad place that they can't, there is a way for them to ask for help and to get the help that they need. So that's really how I think about that. I think it's really important to create a fine balance between honoring that and creating space for people while not going too far and absolving them from their own personal responsibility.
One, I think you mentioned, and this is anyone who's following Megan, go check this post out. I think a while back you put a post out about the 10 customer commandments. It's definitely worth a read for anyone who's in the customer side or customer facing side of business, or even in sales, for example, because eventually some of those prospects become customers as well. Now, if you think about that, this is written, of course, with your more than a decade of experience in customer success as well. How do we create the right balance, knowing that a customer has the power, and also the fact that they may not always be right? Because I think, especially this is coming from a lot of newer folk entering into the customer success or customer support space. Always you hear the customer's always right, and they're sort of willing to bend backwards to figure out what's there for the customer. How do we get that act right? Because, like you said in the commandment as well, the customer's not always right. And yeah, if you can just sort of explain to the wider audience of what you meant there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the most important thing to remember when you're working with customers is they are purchasing your product and service to achieve a specific outcome. That's ultimately why they have, bought your software, bought your service, whatever it is that you're selling. So you have to keep that top of mind at all times. This customer has an expectation that they're going to get X results because of working with you. And so when I say something like the customer is not always right, sometimes customers will ask for things or sort of express something that is rooted in what they think that they need to get the outcome that they want. But often you are the expert, which is why they've sought out your product or service. And so instead of just saying yes to everything the client asks for, really what that was about was to think critically of what's underlying this ask. What is the customer really trying to say? And anchor in what is our goal here? What outcome are we trying to provide? And not blindly just trying to keep the customer happy or what you perceive as happy, and actually focus on what the customer outcome you're trying to drive is. Henry Ford has the famous quote of, if I asked, a customer what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, right? So that sort of illustrates this point of people don't always know exactly what they want. What they really wanted was to go from point A to point B faster, right? And then the car was the solution, not the faster horse. So sort of taking that same cliche or that same old quote and applying it there. I think at the end of the day, sometimes people will get caught up in building a relationship or you could be best friends with your customer, but if you're not delivering on that outcome, they're not going to renew your product or service. So staying really focused on delivering on that promise is really the most important thing.
Now, pivoting from the customer more to an internal use case, I think you've spoken in the past about employees having to manage up. How can you prioritize communication with your boss, for example, and how can you manage when your relationships with your boss isn't that strong as well? How does one figure that out?
Yeah, and so managing up is a really important skill. It took me some time to develop it in my own career. I think that, kind of similar to your customer, your boss is trying to achieve very specific goals and outcomes. And so to manage up effectively, you really need to understand what are the company goals and the priorities. Um, Based on that, for my manager or my boss, what are they ultimately accountable to deliver at the company level? And then how do I fit into that? What am I contributing that ladders up into my manager's goals and therefore the company goals? Getting really clear on that is really important. So that clarity is key and foundational so that you really understand what's most important. Once you understand what's most important, then it's time to deliver, right? It's time to get the work done and ultimately deliver on those goals, take the necessary actions required to do that. Like anything in business, though, it's usually not as simple. So problems may arise, you'll have progress, you might run into some obstacles that prevent you from moving ahead. And so the whole concept of managing up is making sure that you have that clarity and alignment and that you're communicating effectively along the way so that your boss can unblock you or help you move through an obstacle, right? Or you can keep them apprised of good news and bad news so they're hearing it from you first. And ultimately, if you're able to not only focus on achieving your goals that you have, but help your manager achieve theirs, I've found that that's typically how careers are accelerated. And how really strong performers rise to the top.
Absolutely. I think I've seen that before in my own personal journey as well. The fact that whenever I used to take up a lot more of my superior or boss's work is when I saw opportunities for growth, literally. There's like
Yep.
it made their life a lot more easier. So I think there's a big shout out for anyone out there who's looking to grow, to climb up the ladder. I think it's a great place to do. Know what your boss is struggling with or trying to figure out, solve that for them, take up those responsibilities, it's a very clear path for you to success and growth up the ladder as well. Now, moving from the team to actual leadership as well, right now, while being in like say senior leadership positions in the past or present, how do you think leaders can build in sort of a great structure within their company? And at what point perhaps should they start hiring, delegating? How does one look at all of that?
Yeah, so I think when you are, when you're building early, I think that it's very typical to have a small team and each of those team members wears many hats, right? And I actually really like the building phase. I've been a part of many early stage companies, and I like building sort of something from nothing. Often you find that the people that really enjoy that phase, and I would consider myself this in many ways, is sort of more of a generalist versus a specialist, right? You can kind of do a little bit of everything. You can market and sell and, serve your customers. You can run payroll. You can, review a legal contract. You can kind of do a little bit of everything. I think that once you achieve some growth milestones at a company, that's not realistic to manage your company in that way anymore. So I think I don't know if there's any like black and white rules about this, but I would say as you start to hit, 1 million, 5 million, 10 million in annual revenue, these are revenue milestones where you're going to have to assess, okay, what is required from an org structure or org design for the next phase of growth? And what roles are the most important for me to fill? So again, I think it will depend upon your business, but I think you need to be assessing at each of these stages, where do I need to bring in some specialist talent to really help me get to the next phase? So whether that's, a people leader, a sales leader, a success leader. And I think it's going to depend on the organization as well, depending on the founding team and the strengths that they have. And where they need, where they have gaps and where they need to find the next set of team members that are going to come in, fill those gaps, add a layer of sort of specialization and experience that the company really needs.
Great. Now, actually, I mean, I should have probably started off with this question itself. The fact that this is, of course, season two is just focused on women revenue leaders, but what do you think is the most significant barrier to female leadership, and how can we really change that? How can companies begin to change a lot of that?
Um, I think that in my experience, I think the biggest barrier is what I would probably call. So I'll sort of answer this in two ways. I'll sort of suggest a barrier sort of at the company, organization, societal level, and then I would say a barrier within individual women. So I think that there's still, despite a lot of the progress, I think there's still a very real unconscious bias in the business world about women being able to be effective leaders. You see that in just total number of, women CEOs, women founders, et cetera, right? I think that's starting to change, but we have a long way to go. And I think that can also show up in different ways. Like, for example, I am an emotional person, but I've worked in organizations where, oh, you're being really emotional, you're a woman, when the truth is the CEO is, as a man, is just as emotional and angry or this or that, but the emotion is just expressed in a very different way, and a way that's considered acceptable versus not acceptable, right? And these are just norms that have existed for so long. It takes a while, I think, for those to be broken down and for new norms to be rebuilt. And so, I have seen it where, I've had a male counterpart make a lot more money than me for the same job, right? I have the perception that it's taken me longer to get a promotion. So those things are real, and you have to be aware of them and navigate them. I think that, on an individual basis, I think that sometimes women can hold themselves back. I know that I have my own self-doubt. People talk about imposter syndrome a lot of the time. You do see that men are more willing to go for something, even if they're not qualified or prepared for it. And women are not as typically, right? There's obviously exceptions, but typically not quite that way. So I know that I've had my own limiting beliefs or self-doubt that's held me back at times, and that's something that I work on. But I think generally women are a lot more harder on themselves than men. And so I think it's an important personal development milestone to work through that as an individual, if that's something that you have. So you can't change the external forces, you can know that they exist and do your best to work around them. And then you can work on any of your own internal development that's going to really ensure that you're not getting in your own way.
Awesome. I hope that inspires a lot of other aspiring women leaders out there who are trying to get into this, trying to really make a big name for themselves as well. Overcome that self-doubt. It's much harder than what it sounds like, but so overcome that and then progress forward as well. Great. Now let's move on to the next part: is how do you align customers' problems and issues and make them feel validated in a larger sense?
Make customers feel validated?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think actually I have a framework that I use really for any conversation. It's called LARing: listen, acknowledge, align, ask, resolve. And what I find is, whether it's your customer, your employee, your boss, your friend, everyone wants to feel heard and validated. And so I think a lot of this comes down to how you interact with people. A lot of people are really bad listeners. Listening just means listening, not talking, not interrupting. The acknowledge part, the second step of LARing, is really powerful as well, because after somebody tells you something, you essentially repeat back what they said, summarize it in your own words. And that's truly how people feel heard, because you've proven that you've listened and that you've comprehended what they've said. Now, listening and validating and acknowledging someone is not the same thing as agreeing or saying that they're right? But that's secondary, and depending on the situation, that's not always important either. But I think that how you communicate is really key and really important. Now, in a customer setting, if they're coming, with complaints, or, they're unhappy about something, or an expectation wasn't met, then you need to work through that. You need to understand where they're coming from, what they need, what the true issue is. You need to make them feel heard and diffuse the situation. And then ultimately, you need to solve the problem or provide some resolution to whatever's going on. But that framework is really effective no matter what the situation is.
Love the framework. I especially love the part around the fact that acknowledging does not necessarily always mean agreeing.
Yes.
I think the fact that even just acknowledging the fact that, yes, I mean, we understand you have this problem, but needn't necessarily be the right solution, or what you're asking for needn't necessarily have to be the right thing that is there for you. But that's a great, very powerful point there. Awesome. Now, given in the same similar kind of context, right? How important do you think emotional quotient is for a customer-facing teams, for example? How can teams learn to deal with empathy, and how can that be really honed as a skill, for example, to empathize a lot more with your customer? Given, I think, classic example, like you said, you get a barrage of complaints coming in, the customers are going to they're of course angry about something or something else that's going on. How does one learn to empathize with the customer, and how important is emotional quotient as well for that?
Yeah, I think emotional intelligence is super important. The Laring method that I described is a very strong, actionable framework that effectively exhibits really high EQ. So the listening piece is, I'll kind of go through each of the steps a little bit more because I think it really hits on this. So listening, we talked about; acknowledge, we talked about. The third step is align. And again, aligning is not about agreeing. If anyone is in a heated emotional state, the first step is to diffuse the emotion. You're not going to have a rational conversation with an emotional person. So it's important that you recognize that, and that you take the steps to let them vent, right? Let them express themselves, receive it, listen, acknowledge. And then align is really just making them feel seen, heard, and understood. Hey, I were in your position, I would be really frustrated too. That sucks. As soon as you acknowledge people and make them feel that their emotions are valid, then they start to let their guard down. You can see almost the breath that they'll let out when you do that, right? And then you can switch into problem solving. I think what I see a lot is sometimes people know what the problem is and want to rush to solve it. But if you rush to problem solving without taking these initial steps, they're still going to be angry and find something to latch on to about. If you take the time to properly process that emotion, then people are with you along the way. And even if you can't, even if there's only so much you can do to resolve the issue, if you can make them feel good about going through the process, it makes all the difference.
We're almost heading towards the end. I've just got a couple more questions as well. One thing, we'll have to address the fact that there is an economic downturn. We can see it, we're seeing it, we're hearing it in the news. Given that there is a very imminent threat of whatever is happening right now, what do you think leaders in their positions can do to sort of prevent general fear among employees? Right? Are there any tips that companies should be using or leaders should be using at this time to sort of address the situation and, of course, maintain a sort of sense of balance within their teams?
Yeah, I think this really comes down to transparency. I think making sure that you're communicating regularly about, the health of the business. If things are not going in a good direction, that there's some communication about it, so people understand the situation that they're in. I always like to tell people, especially in the startup world, which I've sort of always been a part of, there's always an element of risk. Nothing is really a sure thing. And so I think also putting that into perspective can be really powerful. All of us are going to have multiple chapters in our career at lots of different companies. Some chapters will end because we choose to move on. Other chapters will end because something happened in the business and it was our time to leave. And not to discount the, emotional sort of impact, whether of a layoff, for example, that can be very difficult for anyone to go through. It's a very natural part of business. And so it's just like removing the personal element and understanding that like, this is what the game is about. That said, when you're at your company, your talent destination, you have a choice with how transparent you can be with your team about the health of the business, the runway, how things are going, so that people don't feel blindsided. Fear is natural, but I think as leaders, you can sort of create that perspective, be transparent and honest, have integrity. And I think those are the things that are important to consider sort of as leaders.
Megan, before we go, just a couple more things. So of course, your podcast as well as a podcast that everyone should go listen to as well, Talent Destination. Great name, by the way. But are there other podcasts as a leader, are you inspired by, or you're following, or is there something, either the podcast or a book that you've probably recently been inspired by, or is it something that's your go-to podcast that you want to share with the larger group that you've been following?
I mentioned Christopher Lochhead at the beginning when I discussed native digital and native analog. Check Lochhead on marketing. And he also has another podcast called Follow Your Different. I really like him because he always makes me think about things in a different way. And so I like podcasts that really challenge sort of the status quo and kind of really make you think in a way that you didn't before. So a lot of his content is really thought-provoking, and definitely recommend people check that out.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Megan. Real pleasure for having you over here. It's great having wonderful points that you discussed as well. And I think for the larger audience, for companies looking to build a human-centric or people-centric firm, there's a great points as well for you here. Also for other women leaders out there or aspiring women leaders as well, go through this podcast. There's some great learnings. And anyone who's on a customer-facing team, there's some great learning, great value as well. Go and check out. If you haven't listened to it or you're just looking at the podcast right now, there's some great learning here. Thanks a lot, Megan. It was a pleasure having you over at The Hype is Real.
Thanks so much, Sandeep. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.